Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the SEAI 2022 National Energy Research and Policy Conference. I'm Margie McCarthy. I'm Director of Research and Policy Insights with SEAI, and I'll be your chair through our morning sessions. So with all that's happening in our headlines, from energy security to carbon budgets to the very visible and tragic impacts of climate change in Pakistan, the societal transformation we need to make is all too clear, and we need to make it fast. Changing what we do, how we do it, and what we value is a fundamental but necessary shift for our society. Exploring this throughout today, we'll open with setting the scene, a really interesting conversation, looking forward to myself. And then we'll be following that with a research sprint, which will showcase some of the cutting edge research being funded by SEAI and others in supporting communities and understanding behavioural change. Then this afternoon, we're going to hear from various national and international experts on how to ensure communities, citizens and society are really at the heart of Ireland's energy transition. And if nothing else, COVID has taught us that it takes an all hands on deck approach to really make societal change happen. So finally, our closing panel will be opened with a statement from climate activist Jessie Sheehan, and that'll be followed by a panel decision on how to accelerate the necessary energy transition in Ireland. So before I introduce our guests for our first panel discussion, I'd like to introduce our CEO, William Walsh, to welcome you this morning.
On behalf of the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland, welcome to our 2022 National Energy Research and Policy Conference. This is an important annual event that brings together people from energy research, policy, industry and community groups to learn from and connect with research and discuss how we can use it to transform society to deliver Ireland's energy revolution. This conference series was launched in 2019. Previous conference teams have focused on transforming Ireland's electricity sector in 2019, the heat sector in 2020 and the transport sector in 2021. Today's conference is focused on the theme of societal transformation. We have a diverse and interesting lineup today, including Irish policymakers, experiences from people in our energy utilities, academics, young people, and international experts. I myself am particularly looking forward to first hearing Dr. Mike Ryan from the World Health Organization on how a global challenge was addressed by both scientific innovation and citizen action. Then later today, I look forward to hearing from Jessie Sheehan, a young climate activist who has been speaking out for climate action. Energy research and innovation are a key component of SEAI's new Statement of Strategy 2022 to 2025. We are committed to supporting new research which will accelerate Ireland's sustainable energy transformation, as well as further develop our research partnerships and collaborations, both nationally and internationally. We will also enhance the role that we play in connecting research directly to policy to support and inform policymakers, and this is our key aim of the conference today. SEAI's National Energy Research Development and Demonstration funding supports innovative energy research projects across all disciplines. This fund is open to companies as well as third-level educational bodies, public sector bodies, and semi-state bodies. Over the last 5 years, we've supported approximately 200 innovative energy research projects, connecting the outputs of funded research with citizens, businesses, companies, policymakers, as well as into our SEAI programs. And this is a key priority of the program. Over the next 4 years of our strategy, we will work together to drive reduction and replacement of fossil fuel usage. The energy revolution requires fundamental change across all aspects of Irish society, and we look forward to learning from the discussions and insights shared here today on how to support that change. Ultimately, we must all play our part in societal transformation to a clean and secure energy future. And finally, welcome to all attending today, and many thanks to all the presenters for contributing your experience, your expertise and time to our annual flagship research conference. Thank you.
Sorry, thank you, William. Next, I'd like to welcome Minister Eamon Ryan. Minister will speak to us about one of the biggest challenges in our energy transition, that of decarbonising the heat sector. It's a really strong example of how research outputs are underpinning policy right now, but where a societal movement is required to really drive the changes to happen.
Hello, I'm delighted to be here to open this Research and Development Conference. The role of SAI in providing data and research insights is critical to raising awareness across the research community and in the public about our move to reduce carbon emissions. The work of SAI ensures that there's a solid basis of evidence for all our policy development. Ireland's renewable energy share of heat was 6.8% in 2021, up half a percentage point on the previous year, which is welcome, but still far short of the 2020 national target of 12%. The National Heat Study was published by SAI in February this year and is a comprehensive analysis of the options for reaching net zero emissions from that sector by 2050. This study shows that an unprecedented ramp-up of effort and potentially additional measures are needed if the heat sector is to deliver its share of the emissions cuts. The findings of the National Heat Study, therefore, are going to inform the recommendations in relation to how we meet our new targets. The response in 16 of the National Economic and Social Forum outlines that DEC will develop a national policy statement on heat based on the outcomes of that National Heat Study, including a key focus on the decarbonisation of our building stock and the development of district heating. Analysis conducted as part of the heat study suggests that district heating could provide as much as 50% of our building heating demand in Ireland. As part of the 2021 Climate Action Plan, a district heating steering group has been established to coordinate the rollout of policies and measures to support district heating in Ireland. The steering group is focusing on the four main pillars necessary for the expansion of district heating: in research, in finance, in regulation, and in planning. So relevant and specialist working groups are also focusing on each of these four key areas. One of those groups, the Research and Policy Working Insight Group, consists of a range of stakeholders with an interest in using research and emerging policy to support the development of district heating and cooling systems in Ireland. Led by SAI, this important working group provides expert advice to the steering group by identifying and prioritising the most relevant research at a national level and also internationally, as well as looking at what's new and emerging. The Research and Policy Insights Working Group will use the findings from the study to inform the key recommendations needed to ensure that by 2030, our targets for district heating are achieved. This is important. We're a difficult time for our country as international fossil fuel prices mean that people's bills and budgets are real under pressure. So this is important. Get the research right. We set our policy measures based on good science and on what's practical and achievable, and then we deliver. Wish you very best luck with that important work.
Thank you, Minister. So I have now the very great pleasure of introducing Dr. Mike Ryan of the World Health Organization. So I have no doubt that you're no stranger to any of us, Mike. Mike played his key leadership role in coordinating and advising on our global response to the COVID pandemic. He's been at the forefront of managing acute risks to global health for nearly 25 years. And he also hails from County Sligo, so he's one of us. Good to see you again, Mike, and welcome this morning.
Good morning, how are you?
Very well, thanks, very well. Mike, there's so many things that you've said, and in particular over the last 2 years, we've been hearing and seeing you more and more on our screens that are relevant and pertinent today. In particular, I think I said this to you, what struck me was that history will judge us on how we responded to the poorest communities in their darkest hour. But I think really relevant to this morning is your statement around how unless we can solve the problem of vaccine inequity, if we can't get that right, how can we get climate justice right? So many people say that COVID is quite different in terms of climate action. It was a significant disease, but the response, whilst hard, it was not straightforward, but it was a vaccine, stay at home, wear masks, a test, and the climate change is too complicated. We can't get the same reaction, and the impacts are too far away. But that's not the case anymore, Mike. I mentioned this morning some of those impacts that we're seeing in the news today. So can you talk to us a little bit about your point on vaccine inequity for a moment, and what have we learned through this global tragedy that we're not through yet? What has it taught us about our road to climate action and justice?
Maybe the journey is slightly similar, but COVID was a fantastic scientific revolution in the sense of bringing scientific knowledge to bear on a really complicated problem. We didn't understand the disease, we didn't understand the virus, we didn't understand how to build countermeasures. And in doing that, it was a great victory, but that was not enough. The knowledge and the knowing wasn't enough, and it still isn't enough to stop the virus, because it's the application of that knowledge that is the real answer. So having knowledge, having science is fantastic. It's a necessary prerequisite for success in any human endeavor. But being unable to apply that, or that knowledge not being accepted, is a major obstacle, or how that knowledge is shared in an equitable fashion. And I think I've heard people talk about climate change and say that many communities in developing countries are the ones being affected first and worst in the climate crisis. We've seen that in COVID too. But we've also seen, for me, the worst phenomenon, last and least. So these communities are affected first and worst, but they're the communities that receive help last and they receive the least help. So we have to look at that end of things. And in one ways, we should be all very proud of what was achieved, and especially the Irish community. I think community resilience in Ireland, community participation, the ways in which people sought knowledge, the activation of community solidarity, all of those things were wonderful to behold. I was very proud to be Irish witnessing that. Now, there were tensions and there were difficulties and there was distrust, but I think Ireland reacted extremely well, and many other countries did. But when we had these fantastic new innovations, we were not able to share them to those who needed them most. When we talked about frontline health workers, we talked about vulnerable people all around the world. We knew who was dying, we knew why, we knew the ones that were most likely to die. Yet, 2 years into the crisis, we still have not fixed that. And imagine right now the impact that COVID has had. 2 years of a crisis that in reality kills a small percentage of the people it affects. And look what it's done to the global economy. Look what it's done to politics. Look what it's done to economics. Look what it's done to our societies, the disruption. Now we face into maybe 50 years or 100 years of climate crisis and instability. Are we going to be able to withstand that slower onset, but deep emergency that's going to be created by climate change, and is being created right in front of our faces right now? So no, the experience was both heartening and was uplifting, and on the other hand, deeply tragic and deeply disturbing. And it's very hard for me at this point, before we even end the pandemic, to resolve those two emotions.
Yeah, and interesting, Mike. How do you think we overcome that feeling of doing it for the common good? Have you seen any examples where we've succeeded in that? Because that essentially is the answer to climate. If we could really get people to think about this small blue planet as one global community, have you seen any really good results from our evidence of that?
Well, not just in COVID, I mean, many other interventions I've done and been part of over the years. I think we get things wrong, in a sense. I use an analogy of only a number of months ago, watching a documentary about the building of the Golden Gate Bridge in California. And I had never realized you have to build a suspension bridge from both sides. You can't actually build it from one side to the other. And I think a lot of our mental model of development and of science and of research and application is develop it globally, and then it trickles down into communities. And therefore, the scientists know best, the experts know best, governments know best. And unless and until that is turned around and you build from the community back up, you can generate the knowledge at global level. But unless that knowledge is integrated into people's daily lives, unless people see and understand and participate in the process of making those decisions, it will always be external. And that's why COVID generated a lot of solidarity at local level. People saw the local effects. People didn't set up food banks and visit people in long-term care facilities because they saw it on the television. They did it because their mother, their father, their friend, their neighbor was sick. They saw the direct impact, they saw the impact on their lives, and they saw that they could do something about it. They could protect themselves, they could protect others, they could bring meals to doctors and nurses working in hospitals, they could visit the elderly. They could take action, they had agency. They had ownership of part of the solution. And I think sometimes we in the scientific community, and it's not a bad thing, or it doesn't make us bad people, but it means that we have an arrogant interpretation of the wonderfulness of our knowledge and how we can't understand why people just don't accept that. Yeah. They can't understand why people just don't see the logic. And we get frustrated, and then we become even more directive, and we raise our voices louder, and we increase the level of alarm, right? And that shuts people down even more. So we end up creating a very dysfunctional dialogue. It's not even a dialogue, it becomes a monologue, and it becomes a shouting match. And I think we do a lot of research, and that research is very important. But again, we tend to focus on technological research, scientific research, research on drugs, research on, and you see the same in climate. The thing we really struggled in was understanding human reaction to a crisis, understanding how humans process knowledge and information about threat, about risk, about vulnerability, and how they absorb, who they listen to, where they listen to, who influences, how they process knowledge, and then how do they take action on that knowledge? Because if you give someone a catastrophic scenario, most people go to the pub because they think, well, there's nothing I can do about that, right? You know, and I think, you know, the more we in science and research continue to just raise alarms, cry wolf all the time, we just generate anxiety. We don't generate action. And the problem is we're an anxiety generating machine now, not an action generating machine. And we need to look at how we can switch that around. I mean, that's my experience in epidemics. It may not be exactly the same in climate, but that's my personal experience. And that's with communities all over the world.
Can I draw you back then to the Irish experience? You touched on it a minute ago, and you know, so many of us working close to a crisis like you're doing, or many of us working on the energy transition or in climate action, we get frustrated. Like you said, we start banging a drum because it's like, look, the evidence is so clear. Why aren't we getting change in behaviours? But we did see a glimmer of hope in Ireland in the response to COVID. We had one of the most successful uptakes of the vaccine globally, and we generally did behave cohesively as a society. What, from your inside and outside view, because you were looking at it from the Eagle view, but also being an Irish person looking at it, what do you think we got right, and what can we learn from that to try and apply it to climate?
Well, I think there's still, I mean, it's something I remark on all the time. Irish people like to talk, but they also like to listen. You'll see the survival of things like radio in Ireland, or it's an amazing phenomenon. I was home on holidays. I don't listen to radio here in Switzerland, but you go home to Ireland, you spend half your day with one ear on a radio listening to some talk show. So we do, I think, as an increasingly multi-ethnic society, we're good at generating discussion and dialogue, and I do think that's part of the success. I think the other part is that there's still a deep trust and respect in Ireland for people, doctors, for nurses, for scientists. There is that sense, you know, that people still respect knowledge. There's a great respect for the storyteller, for the performer, for anyone who can entertain, anyone who can provide input to communities. Has always been celebrated in Ireland. That idea of being welcome with knowledge, being welcome with any form of performance, entertainment, it doesn't matter. We you know, it's incredible how, you know, in Ireland, things like poetry, things like that are still very prevalent. People still, you know, many of my friends will send me poems, you know, and I think, you know, it's so I do think there's that something about Irish society. We're lucky to still have that. We may be losing it, But there is still that willingness, and there is still trust. And even though we complain about the government and we complain about politicians, and we're constantly doing that in every society, I still think people in Ireland feel connected to their representatives. They often know their representatives. They often know someone who knows that person. They're connected in some way, whether they're one side of the political divide or the other. So there's still a sense in Ireland that people can affect the debate, that you can walk up to your local politician and say something. So I do think there's a sense of, Irish people still have that sense of agency, that sense of ability to act. And I do think that was part of that response. I also think a lot of excellent communicators in Ireland were out there talking all the time. There was transparency. And I think that's very, very important, that you have that transparency from government, transparency from leaders, that you admit when things are bad, you admit when things are wrong. You do not try to cover over, to gloss over, or to create and massage facts. That's a very dangerous thing to do, because that becomes marketing. And it's a very, very big difference, in my view, between communications and marketing. And it's really important that we understand that as we communicate with people, because this is not a once-off communication on climate. And we knew that in COVID. This wasn't going to be one ad campaign and it's all over. This is going to be a process of long-term communication. And it takes weeks, months, and years and decades to build trust, to build that listenership, to build people who trust your voice. And it takes minutes to lose it if you betray that trust. And trust is at the center of this. Who do I trust? Who do I listen to? You know?
Yeah, and I'm going to actually touch on the transparency piece in a minute, but interesting when you say about how you had to keep that trust up through COVID. What did you do at the World Health Organization? Because I know at home here, we had obviously the regular news briefings, and we were very aware in the background that kind of messaging was being tested, and conversations were being had with even representative groups of communities. So what was used in the World Health Organization to keep that, like you said, it's communications, it's two-way dialogue, it's listening as much as speaking, really, isn't it? I think I lost your mic there. Yeah.
No, I'm there. I think WHO is as deeply flawed an organization as any. We're all human beings, and we went on a major learning journey as well during this response. We had to scale up to levels that we've never had to do before. We had to deal with a crisis in 194 countries at one time. Normally our crises are Pakistan, there's a flood, or in Ukraine, there's a war. We know what we need to do in a certain geographic area. It can be overwhelming, but it has geographic limits, and you have a specific idea. We were trying to communicate with multiple cultures through multiple languages in a 24-hour news cycle, where people's perceptions in different countries of infectious disease, their trust in their own governments, the activity of the media and how it's controlled or not controlled was different in every single setting. So our messaging had to work across all of that. So it was a huge challenge to be able to do that credibly, to be able to do that authentically, and to maintain trust and continue communicating the whole time. The one thing we did learn in that, though, and we had been doing it before, but we had never applied it at this level, was not just communicating with governments, but for WHO, communicating directly with populations, but also communicating with groups in civil society. We had a world of work in which we had hundreds of thousands of people around the world working in unions, working in both in employer organizations, in union organizations, talking about work. We had a world of faith in which we had all the major faiths in the world and leaders in those faiths coming on webinars. We were doing webinars with youth organizations, with representation groups for older people, all kinds of different groups.
So a really joint up approach in terms
and just trying to keep the dialogue going, not worrying too much about preparing everything, not worrying about the perfect conference and the perfect pitch and the perfect presentation, but making ourselves available all the time to talk to anybody who wanted to talk about this. It's really hard to do. It's really hard to sustain. And it's really hard to fund, because when you go to the bosses and the donors and say, look, we want to have this massive dialogue with everybody. We want to keep talking to everyone. They say, well, what about the research? Where's the vaccine coming from? So you'll get the money for the vaccine, you get the money for the therapeutics, you get the funding for all of the technology, I call it the yellow ribbon syndrome. You get money for the things that you can cut the yellow ribbon from, open a new institute, build infrastructure.
The social license to operate, or the behaviours and adoption.
And we did the same. We opened new wings on hospitals, and we built field hospitals, and we put up tents, and we did all that. And that was fantastic because it was visible. But it's the invisible stuff. It's supporting the workforce in the front line, and not just supporting them with protective gear, but giving them psychological support for the work they're doing. And recognizing the impact that the epidemic was having, not only on people's health, physical health, but on people's mental health. And the isolation that people were feeling, and dealing with that, also dealing with things now like we're dealing with post-COVID condition, and recognizing that we have literally millions of people around the world struggling with the long-term effects of COVID. It's very easy to keep focusing on preventing COVID, but there's another group of individuals in the world who are really suffering. And it's very easy in a crisis and with the media cycle to get focused on one or two things. And everyone says, well, that's what the media and the world is interested in. We should focus on that. It's very hard then to step away and focus on the stuff that's not sexy, that's not in the news. And I think that's, for me, that's the learning I think that we did. We did a lot of social listening as well. We used artificial intelligence to look at social media feeds all over the world to see how communities were reacting to restrictions. How were they reacting to what was being talked about? Not what we thought people were reacting, or how we saw uptake of masks or purchases of masks, but actually looking at what people were talking about in social media.
It was very personal too, wasn't it? I know I have a network of a group of 30 international people. We share a WhatsApp group, and we're normally talking about work-oriented things, which are quite climate-focused. Instead, we were talking about personal impact and who had been affected, our families, what was going on down the roads, and it was just a whole different approach, really, wasn't it?
Before we also saw too, just one last point on this, we saw governments, however flawed in their responses, having an open and transparent approach, and over time that has worked. We also saw governments who really hurt their own response by leveraging, manipulating, being part of misinformation and the misinformation cycle. We talked about misinformation and disinformation. You know, there's a lot of, we can all misinterpret what's going on, and we can all have genuine doubts. I say this with anti-vaccination. Many people have genuine concerns and reasonable questions about vaccination. Who wants to put anything into your body without understanding what it does, what its side effects are, what its positive consequences are, what its negative consequences are? So doubt is not a disease. And it's the same on climate change. And we have to address people's doubts. And the idea that people, and they're not anti, those people need to be engaged with. And the problem we have in much of our scientific communication is we lump people into the fors and the againsts. We have to work with the people who are against. Because the vast majority of people who are against don't have the right knowledge, don't fully understand, they need more information, they need better engagement, we need to get better. And then at the very edge of that, there's a very small group of individuals who actively manipulate, generate, and disseminate misinformation. And that's a different type of engagement we need with them. And the problem was that it wasn't only people in civil society engaging in those negative behaviors, that was happening too at state level.
I'd like to get back to the apathy piece and how to activate people to get over the sense of helplessness and paralysis. But first of all, I think we'll introduce our two other guests to join us at this stage, Mike. So I'd like to invite Mark Foley and Mary Donnelly to join us in the room. Two significant leaders in Ireland's climate action. And again, I'm sure they don't need any introduction, but in short, Mark is CEO of EirGrid, responsible for developing and operating our national electricity grid. And Mary is chairperson of the Climate Change Advisory Council. The council was established to assess and advise on how Ireland can achieve the transition to a low carbon, sustainable, climate resilient economy. So welcome to you both. Mark, I would just remind people as well that there are questions so we will try for the last 5 minutes of this first morning session to address some of those questions. So please do feel free to put them in, and our closing session later on as well will be dealing with a lot of some of the questions that are coming up. So if we don't get to them all, we'll get to them later. But Mark, I might just jump to you first. So we've heard from Mike about the urgency at hand, the challenges with regard to global health, but also, Michael, when we spoke before, we talked very much about how climate and health they're interwoven, and really they're all symptoms of the same thing. For you, Mark, our energy transition is a key component to our climate action in this country. And I was saying that when you launched your Shaping Our Electricity Future back in COP26, it was only a couple of days, I think, after the renewables target had been increased to 80% from 70%. And I think you thanked everyone for that nice surprise, but you also talked about the technology is here to do it. It's the hearts and minds that we have to win over now. So the societal transformation. So do you want to talk to us about what you meant by that? What's the journey you've been on with regard to that?
Yeah, I suppose, thank you, Margie. And it's great to be here, and well done in organising the conference. And it's lovely Mike is really inspiring. He did a superb job during the COVID crisis. Look, I don't tend to go on for long. Just really to cut to the chase, we have the legislation and the vision in place for one of the most advanced power systems in the world in 2030, courtesy of the government's low carbon and climate action bill. We have most of the policy framework in place. We have Mary's excellent Climate Change Advisory Council, which is leading out on in terms of sectoral budgets and providing law and order and governance around that. I believe firmly we have the technology to deliver all the bits of the jigsaw for a low carbon power system by 2030. What will trip us up are arguably two things. My first major concern is if we don't get the people of Ireland behind this. People become disconnected with the ambition of the energy transition. If they don't feel it's relevant to them, then it'll become a war of attrition over the next decade. And all the technology and all the capital that's available, there's more money than there are projects. We're not short of money. The issue is, can we get people engaged, and can people support the plan? And what we did with Shaping Our Electricity Future was we really stepped back and we invested essentially a year and a half of some of the best brains in the company. Firstly, in terms of trying to explain in simple terms what 2030 might look like and what the roadmap could be, but also to go out and ask far and wide around the country, across civil society, young and old, politicians, business, you name it. And we invested in an inordinate amount of energy, time and resource to connect in to that whole ecosystem of the people of Ireland. And we basically said, look, how do you think we should go about this? We put out 4 options, and crucially, to Mike's point, we made all the data available. Everything we had, be it technical or otherwise, research, we put it all out there. And we went to work, I suppose, evangelizing, educating, but crucially listening. And we created a lot of space to hear back from people as to what their views were. And I think this exercise has served us really well, because we got some really good insight. And crucially, the thing I learned most, and I went into this thinking we had all the solutions, a lot of the solutions in technological terms, the loudest voice we heard was ordinary people saying they wanted to be part of this. And in particular, they wanted to be active, and they wanted, for example, solar on homes to be a very, very important part of this. That was probably the biggest wake-up call, their desire to be active. So
that turned into...
Yeah, it turned out to be quite seminal, actually.
Yeah, just on that very point, Mark, I mean, you spoke about the microgen target within the national plans, and really how when you started out in the Shaping Our Electricity Future journey, you didn't really see that being a big player in the overall plan, but by the end of it, you were convinced. So what was it that convinced the kind of decision makers nationally through those conversations with publics and with the citizens to take that on?
Hearing the voice from the young people in the youth assemblies, from we did citizens assembly type propositions. It was countrywide engagements in hotels. We heard back very, very strongly. If you want us to buy into this, make us part of this, reward us. I think the second thing we learned was, and it's very much part of our DNA, is when we want to build infrastructure in communities, we've got to go in there with an open mind as to what the solution is. And this is a radical change for an engineering organization like ourselves, where we would have prided ourselves, and rightly so, on technical excellence and an ability to come up with the best engineering solution. But the best engineering solution is not always the best social solution. It's not the best solution in terms of winning the hearts and minds of communities. So we've also radically changed our whole engagement proposition. We've made 3 decisions in the last year that we wouldn't have made 5 years ago. We put the converter station for the Celtic Interconnector not in Ockraha, because 1,000 people says we don't want it here. We put it in Ballyadam, and those people are supporting us. We put the North Connacht line underground. And the biggest piece of cable infrastructure in Irish transmission system history for the whole of the Dublin, Meath, Kildare region is going to be done underground. Why? Because people said we'll support you if you do that. And while it might not be the technically best solution, it's still doable. We've listened, and we're currently processing that through planning. So they've got to be active, and they got to be respected. And when we build a project, we need to give something back to the community. And that we are doing through a whole range of offerings when we discuss projects with them.
Thanks, Mark. Mary, I might turn to you. Nothing brings societal transformation more to our minds than recent headlines on energy security, the carbon budgets, the sectoral ceilings. It's not easy, but it's easier to set the overall target than it is to divvy it down into its component parts. Your work through the council has been hugely involved in advising and guiding on this. So can you tell us, really an awful lot of what needs to be done here is around changing what we value in society. As Mark and Mike said, we often have the technology solutions right there and available. How do we drive change in behaviours to actually deliver on those solutions? So can you tell us how the council takes that into account in terms of the behavioural research or what's available to them in how they're advising then how we achieve our climate action?
Thanks very much, Margie, and thanks for the invitation today. And Mike, well done. I have made a note of a number of your comments there because they resonate so closely to the actions that we're taking at the moment. And I think one of the areas that I'd like to pick up on what you were saying in answer to your question, Margie, is that we have knowledge, and the question and the challenge that we're faced with now is applying that knowledge and applying it in a way that, as you say, Mike, moves from anxiety generation to action generation. And part of the challenge that we have, and I believe this is really our pinpoint challenge, is how do we get ownership of the solutions? And this, I think, Mark, is what you were saying too. People, I believe, in Ireland are concerned. They're aware, they're concerned, and they're at a point where they're ready to take action. But they're not 100% sure what it actually means. Sometimes there can be actions that they can take in a relatively easy way, and in other cases, the action is more challenging. And in conversations with people, they say, oh yes, I am very concerned about climate, I want to do my best, and I'm recycling much more, which is excellent. But of course, it doesn't go necessarily to the heart of the message that we have at the moment, which is that 67% of our emissions in Ireland come from fossil fuels. We import pretty much all of our fossil fuels. We might not be able to get them even when we're paying an outrageous price for them, and we have no control on that. And the consequences are that we as a society, and indeed also an economy, are vulnerable. So we have got to make the switch away from our dependence on fossil fuels as fast as possible, use our own resources, and I'll come back to what those are in a minute, because it's in our economic interest, it's in our societal interest, and it's also in our climate interest. And one of the concerns that we have in the council is, how do you get that message across to people in a way that they can absorb it, internalize it, and then act on it? And some of the actions need to be supported by government. And that's why we have our annual review, we have our reports, we have our letters to the government about the policies that they put in place. But some of it also relies on culture. as you were saying, Mike, there, there are strong cultural elements that flow through the Irish society. When we look at the concerns that people have about the cost of living, which is very real and going to be even more real, we talk a lot about electricity. And of course, electricity is hugely important, Mark, and I don't want to downgrade that in any way. It's very visible, but electricity represents 20% of the energy that we use. What about the other 80%? The other 80% is in transport and heat. And where is the conversation around those two areas? And what can we do in those two areas to help people so that they can become part of the solution? Now, if I take transport, it's very visible what we can do on transport. But again, where's the culture? To what extent are we going to be able to be successful in providing people with alternatives? If it's less than a kilometre, we should be taking the exercise. If there's public transport, we should be taking the public transport. Is there enough public transport? Make sure we have it there. And have we got the mindset to carpool or reduce those trips in the car, the private car, which is representing such a high share of our emissions? That's a cultural issue and ultimately becomes a societal one. That's where the community comes in. If the community buys into it and it becomes socially acceptable to carpool, for example, or it becomes, the norm to take the bus, as the case may be, or the train, then you can make the shift. But until you get that cultural change, it's very difficult to maximize the isolated incidents. And of course, the question of heat is very challenging. We have a large housing stock, more than 2 million. We have half of that on oil. To shift out of oil, it's not something you can do from today to tomorrow. What are the opportunities that exist? What are the possibilities that people can use? What's the cost that's going to apply for them coming down the track? It's not always possible for them to pay, even with the grants coming from SEAI. So when you're having the conversation with people, it's great to know what needs to be done. The real issue is, how can you do it? How can you make it happen in a practical sense that relates to the individual that you're talking to? And I think here, one of the areas that we perhaps need to develop even more is the sense of community and cohesion across community and across society. And I think COVID was an area where we did have cohesion across community and across society. We're starting to lose it a little bit in our transition. The idea that parts of the country who are very rich in natural resources feel that they have done enough and they don't need to do any more, which would deprive other parts of the community of that power and energy or whatever, that's not cohesion. I mean, we're all in this together. We're all going to have to make the effort. We're all going to have to share the burden of doing this, because in the end of the day, we're all going to share the benefit. And I think that sense of societal cohesion is one of the areas that is causing a real concern to the council right now.
Thanks, Mary. Actually, a question on that, and really to all of you. This is something that's coming up from the people listening to you this morning. That what you said, Mike, makes complete and total sense around change, and what you've just added there, Mary, as well. But how can it be achieved with an economic system that's structured to reward, I suppose, financial wealth? And we've seen an awful lot of the change that's happening is happening iteratively, where people are trying to do what they've always done in a better, more efficient, energy efficient, or climate friendly, environmentally friendly way, as opposed to maybe doing something completely different, like you're saying, Mary, just completely change the way and you go from A to B. So, like, we've seen examples with the donut economics. We've seen some examples in New Zealand, for example, measuring other things other than well-being, measuring well-being other than GDP. Any views from you, Mary, on that? I mean, we have a short pathway to 2050 as it is. How can we start shifting the way in which we think success looks like, what good looks like for our society?
Well, I don't want to release the information in advance, but we've been working with the OECD on looking at transport and mobility from a well-being lens, which is kind of a different way of looking at it. And we'll be doing the launch of that in the beginning of October with the OECD. But what struck me out of their headline research was that we have, to some extent, in the transport space, gotten ourselves into a bottomless pit. You know, let me take the M50. We had huge congestion, people getting into Dublin, need to have mobility around the city and access to the city. We built the M50. It was 2 lanes. And very quickly, I think it was less than 10 years, it wasn't enough. So we built another lane around it. So by building the M50, we respond to a car driving society.
Yeah.
That encourages more cars in society. That generates congestion, even more congestion. And we respond to that by building more roads, which encourages even more car driving. So at a point in time, we have to stop and say, what are we doing? You know, what are we looking at here? Are we actually, in a structural sense, you know, reinforcing the existing habits, let's call them bad habits for the moment, instead of standing back and saying, you know, we have to structurally change the possibilities for people. You know, the 20-minute city, the possibility of being able to use, you know, different modes of transport in a commuter belt, the whole idea of taking cars off the roads so that people can get on the roads rather than cars, it's a very novel concept. But it's very hard to get public buy-in for that, even though when it happens, people generally are very pleased. So that just illustrates the kind of challenges that we have out there.
Thanks, Mary. Mike, if I could turn to you on that question around our value set as a community and the shift that's required there in terms of what we measure for success. I know you've spoken about this. I was looking through, as I was saying, there were lots of quotes I could have said. So any thoughts on that?
No, I just think we have to be also careful. I think it's called the chattering classes, that we speak to the people who want to be concerned about climate and all of this, because they have the money and they have the house and they're not in negative equity and they have 2 jobs and their kids are in nice schools, and you can recycle more and think about the electric car, and you can think about, but a lot of our society is just struggling to get through today, tomorrow. And these concerns are very distant. We deal as human beings with proximal threats. We're hunter-gatherers by nature. If it's not going to kill us today, you know what? There's a lot of stuff that's going to get us today. That's tomorrow. And it's pushed off because I have other concerns today. You know, everything. And if you're living in that reality where you can't make ends meet, you're struggling to put food on the table, and all of these things, and we spoke about those converging threats. Right now, the people being affected in society by, you know, we've got this confluence of conflict and climate and bad governance around the world, and it's just all generally parts of the world like the Sahel and Horn of Africa are becoming uninhabitable. We have an energy crisis been driven by conflict. We have floods in Pakistan been driven by climate, but we've got health system being destroyed by those floods, which is going to have knock-on effects for years. So this is all intertwined. But in the middle of all that going on, people are living their daily lives, and they're just trying to get by. And unless we find ways to make people's lives better, it's not about getting people to do stuff to make climate better. It's not getting people to do stuff about some distal threat that may fry us all in 10 or 15 years' time. There's a lot of people today don't think they're going to be around in 10 or 15 years' time. There's a lot of people in Ireland today that don't think they're going to be around tomorrow with the stress they're under. So this has got to come back to being about society, about lives, about livelihoods, around people having an opportunity to thrive, not just to survive. And unless we create a thriving society that can then be collectively concerned about distal threats, but unless we start to take away some of the proximal threats, the threats today to people's happiness and contentment, we can't just say we decided that the threat down the road in 50 years' time or 30 years' time is going to affect your life. So I think we have to, this is where the different sectors need to come together. Social equity, social justice, health justice, climate justice are entirely intertwined. The vast majority of people who died in the pandemic died not because of COVID. They died because of lack of access to healthcare. They died because of lack of management of underlying conditions, lack of management of hypertension, lack of management of diabetes. The obesity epidemic did as much to drive mortality in COVID than the virus itself. So unless we address those fundamental underlying issues in our society, I don't believe people may get on board. We'll have campaigns and we'll campaign for this and we'll campaign for that. But unless we understand, I think it's a personal view. This is not a corporate view. It's me just speaking here. And this is what I've learned in going into communities and saying we've got to control the Ebola epidemic in Congo, in the middle of a civil war where people were being shot in the streets. You know, what do you mean? It's your Ebola, it's not our Ebola. You're concerned about Ebola because you're afraid it's going to spread to all the wealthy countries. That's not our concern here today. Our concern here today is putting food on the table and making sure our kids don't get shot on the way to school. That's my concern. If you can address that concern, I'll work with you on Ebola. And I think that's what we have to do. We have to address people's daily concerns and then bring climate and energy into that discussion. Maybe I'm way off base here because I'm not an expert at all, but I think that's where we have to start. You know?
If I may, I think, Mike, one of the things there that I really, really would buy into is that we're asking people to take action for this climate, which, as you quite rightly say, is somewhat remote. And I think the argument has been made that, yes, it's real and it's coming and we need to do something. So I think we're in that space. But I think where we have failed, and I include myself in this, is we haven't presented what the future can look like. You know, we're simply saying what you do today is wrong. But what we're not doing is saying, this is what the future can look like. Do you want that kind of future? And this is how we're going to get to that future. And I think that's a big part of trying to get people on board, to understand what it would look like and what it would feel like into the future. And I think in that context, there is a role for government, obviously, but there's a role also for the public sector. You know, the public sector, for example, in Ireland has gone through a series of energy efficiency measures. They've saved, what, 34%. Now, many of them are buildings that are heated with, say, modern technologies, heat pumps, they're insulated, all of that. You know, to what extent are we inviting the population in to come and feel and see and touch what the end results looks like, what it feels like, you know, in the depths of winter, when, you know, if you haven't done your insulation, you haven't upgraded your house is damp, even with the heat on. You go to a building that is insulated in the middle of winter, it's not damp. I mean, it's just that kind of feeling, touching experience that I think is really important, that we need to make available to people so that they can work for a positive solution rather than defensively against a negative solution.
Yeah. I mean, it even goes back to the research around, you know, that sense of belonging. You can't be what you can't see. It's really building scenarios and being able to visualize the future is so effective across all walks of life and challenges that we're facing. So applying it to climate makes absolute sense. I might go back in one moment to the transparency thing. Mark, I just wanted to bring in as a key player, obviously, a key actor in our energy transition. There's a question in here about, is there a need for a national climate emergency team in the same way as NEFIT gathered during COVID? And we know that there is, you know, there's a national response now to energy security. We know there are climate dialogues. There are significant national activities happening. What's your sense, though, in terms of that question? Do we need it to be emergency mode, press the red button, and we're all on message in the same way as COVID was?
Maybe less emergency, more. I was incredibly impressed by the Irish government's response when COVID first landed. The first 6 months were extraordinarily impressive in terms of the quality of the communication, you know, getting and connecting with people in the country in an unprecedented pandemic situation. And I've always felt since then, if we could leverage that type of approach, that sense of collegiality, sense of common purpose, into a discussion about climate, which included education, to Mari's point, painting a simple picture of the future that my 91-year-old mother can understand, children can understand, that continuous campaign of information, of education, of reaching out, I think is absolutely essential. I'd be less inclined to put the emergency before it because we're worn out from emergencies. We really are, and I think we've got to find a vehicle that's cross agency, very good on comms, and get that reach out. And I think we really need to do it. I remember talking to Minister Ryan about when COVID's over, we need to do this. But of course, COVID had a very, very long tail on it, and we could never seem to, just before we could start to create space in public discourse, bloody Russians started with their egregious actions. But seriously, we just can't seem to find that gap. But when we can, I think we must do that, because education and engagement and listening is critical. And the government did a super job way back on COVID in the first 6 months. And so we know we can do it, and we need to get back there. But at the moment, it's a very crowded space between energy, Russia, and everything else to get any airtime.
Thanks, Mark. Mike, you're nodding in violent agreement there. Would you like to come in and make a comment?
No, I think that's true, that it's finding those gaps in people's consciousness where people can engage, because they're just being fed and people are just being bombarded all the time. We're running out of, energy to deal with crisis. It's just one crisis after another. People just can't cope with just being fed crisis all the time, because people want to have a life. They want to get on. I mean, there are people in Ireland, who said, "Isn't it great? Our weather is improving, because it was hot this summer." There's that feeling, that people just want to have a better life. And I think we have to present a future to people that's about sustainable living. And sustainable living isn't just about energy and climate. It's about the built environment. Air pollution itself is not to do with climate per se, it's to do with emissions. We're talking about a very dangerous built environment in which the car is king. It's not about cars and energy. It's about safe environments for our children to walk to school. So I think we have to present a future that's more integrated, a future that presents a world in which there's a fairer attribution of resources, a fair sharing of resources. Do I want a climate neutral hospital or school? You know what? Give me a hospital or school that has enough staff and that can not have people sitting on trolleys for 3 days, or that are schools that don't have 28 or 38 kids in a school one teacher with no special needs assistant. So if we need to bring those things together. Justice and fairness needs to be central. And climate and social action and social equity and health, they need to come with that. I honestly think, because in other words, you may get that space mark in the next few months, and climate will get in there for a few months or a year, and then something else will come and displace your crisis, and you won't be able to sustain it. And I think we need to get the sectors together, and we need to look at how we inhabit the planet, not just how we inhabit the planet as a climate system, but as a biologic system, as a social system. And making that sustainable and making it such that we want our kids to live in a better world than we grew up in. And we certainly in Ireland live in a much fairer, more open society than our parents lived in. And we have a huge debt of gratitude to the generations that went before, that gave us a society that's more open, that's more fair, that's more transparent, where we can trust government, where everyone is more included. We're not perfect, but we're on that journey, and we've made huge progress as a society over the last 70 years. And with all of the frailties and with all of the injustices that went along that way, we've made progress. And I think that's what it needs to be about, making progress as a society. And the next challenge in making progress as a society is climate, it is energy, because that is going to be part of our progression to an even more fair, even more just, even more sustainable civilization. And I think that's the narrative, that's the story we need to tell, not a story of destruction, and not a story of disaster, but a story of development, of progress, and of justice. And if we do that, I think people can buy into that for a longer period of time.
That's really powerful, Mike. Thanks. I mean, it really comes down to, and it's a book, but it really struck me when I read it, is the future we choose, and it's the we choose. It will be fantastic for us to be able to rise above those individual, even I know those very vulnerable communities who are struggling day to day just to survive, as you said, try to come to some common understanding of what that future is that we're all working towards, because challenges are, I suppose, so much easier to overcome if you all know we're working to that ultimate goal. Thank you. I'm afraid we've come to close. I could continue all day listening to the three of you. We have many other wonderful speakers. This conversation has been really interesting and a really inspiring, motivating, let's get things done start to the day. It's my turn to say a very big thanks. I can say it's echoed throughout some of the comments coming through from people, and sorry we didn't get to all the questions from everybody, but a big thank you to you, all three of you, from the audience and from me as chair today. I really, really appreciate your input and for giving your time. So at this stage, thanks, Mary. At this stage, we are going to take a 10-minute break. Hopefully that's kick-started you off to and kept the pulse rate going now for the rest of the day. Looking forward to hearing your questions and interaction from everybody as we move out throughout the day, but we're going to take a 10-minute break and restart at 10:10 when we are turning to our next panel, where they'll be setting a real national context and what action is underway and underpinning societal change in Ireland. So thank you. Welcome back, everyone. It's my great pleasure to chair our next session, another really interesting group of panelists with a very diverse range of perspectives on our societal change necessary. Again, look, a reminder that we have a short time at the end of this session for questions and answers, so please do continue to post. There's a lively conversation happening already. At the end of our first speaker, Dr. Rob Mooney, Rob has to leave us a little bit early in the panel, so we will take questions for Rob at the end of his presentation, but otherwise we'll wait until the end of all of the other speakers and deal with them together. So I will introduce Rob. He's joining us from the Department of Environment, Climate and Communications to speak on public participation and societal engagement supported through the National Dialogue on Climate Action. So thanks, Rob. Very aware that you have to go, so we will take that quick question, but otherwise I'll hand over to you.
That's fantastic, Margaret. Thank you very much. And just to say, I'm delighted to be here. It's a really, it's a great pleasure for me to be invited here to speak to everyone today. As Margaret said, I'm going to give a quick overview of the work that we're doing in the National Dialogue on Climate Action. So I suppose to set the context, as I'm sure most participants here are aware, I won't go into this in any detail, but the background to all of this is essentially began with the European Green Deal, which established, the ambition to become carbon neutral continent by 2050 across Europe. This was enshrined in EU climate law in 2021. Before this, we in Ireland had developed our 2019 Climate Action Plan, which set out our key ambitions in Irish climate policy. But after this EU sort of Green Deal and climate law, we moved into a space where the Programme for Government really committed to net zero emissions by no later than 2050. The Climate Action Act 2021 put this ambition in legislation, and our Climate Action Plan 2021 has now set these clear steps to delivering this out in action. And at the moment, we're preparing the Climate Action Plan for 2023, which continues to progress this. So that's just a really brief legislative and policy context for the work that we do. What I want to talk about this morning really is more about the how we're trying to transition to carbon neutrality in sort of a collaborative and a collective sense. So we recognize clearly that this transition requires fundamental changes across pretty much all aspects of society and our economy, and obviously very critically to this audience, how we use energy and how we consider, I suppose, how we use energy from a behavioral sense. We recognize and we commit to government leading by example, but we also need to change hearts, minds and behaviors of communities and individuals across Ireland. To do this, it's our view that we need to establish a new social contract between government and the people around climate action. In 2021, we held a series of climate conversations. We heard from nearly 4,000 people through a variety of different mediums, workshops, public consultations, focus groups, etc. We heard a voice of a public who are really clearly responsive, they're engaged, and they conveyed a sense of urgency and an enthusiasm to work with government and to progress on climate action. We were also able to identify where people weren't making, were making changes, but they also lacked information, knowledge, resources, or the capacity to make those changes. And they asked for joined up thinking and ambitious policies to be reflected critically where they live. The insights of this consultation directly informed the Climate Action Plan 2021. It built public participation into our consideration and the development and design of the Annex of Actions as well, and ultimately allowed us to improve policy implementation. But we weren't, that was a first really deep dive into this kind of insights of the public to understand and to experiment with public participation in a really progressive way. That taught us not only where the public are coming from, where the challenges are, but it also allowed us to reflect on the mechanisms and the mediums by which we're engaging with people. We realized really clearly that whilst this is affecting everybody, it certainly doesn't affect everybody equally, and that our ambition needed to be to engage, enable and empower everyone in society to transition towards carbon neutrality in a way that was inclusive, fair and fundamentally accessible. So we based Prior to this, I'd done a lot of work in the COVID communications and, the NEFID behavioral research group. So basing a lot of the insights and the mechanisms and processes that we developed for COVID, we developed a strategic model around the national dialogue on climate action. The fundamental basis of this was to improve climate literacy through education and strategic communications, deliver engagement events that bring politicians, policymakers, stakeholders, communities, etc., together to explore, I suppose, challenges, but also then examine how we can accelerate on the delivery of these climate actions. And then fundamentally measure the efficiency of our work through an ongoing review and research program, but also evaluate the efficacy of the program that we're delivering. So we have a very robust research program around that. This is just to give you a flavor of the sort of strategic approach that we're taking. So you can see that our inputs into the national dialogue are essentially our policy priorities, the climate action plan, the insights from the climate conversations, but critically the research and evidence base that we've pulled together through not only our own research, but the work of the EPA, the work of the SEI, and major sort of research organizations across the country. Our three key pillars of climate literacy, as I said, engagement, and then our research and evidence base. But the point of this slide is to demonstrate that we're moving to an outcome-based model, i.e. we're not just delivering things like climate literacy or trying to promote things through engagement. We're measuring, are we actually improving climate literacy? Are we actually empowering people through the work that we're doing? And is our evidence base fit for purpose? Are we measuring, are we able to measure the effectiveness of what we're doing? So as part of this, we produce a series of reports from each engagement event that we do, measuring our outputs and outcomes. But also we synthesize these on an annual basis, and we'll be publishing shortly 2, hopefully, benchmark studies in not only the climate conversations to show the voice of the public and stakeholders, but also an evaluation and examination of best practice in public participation and the promotion of behavioural change in Ireland. This is just to give you a quick flavour of how inclusive the programme of the NDCA was in 2022. So through our climate literacy program, we engaged strategic communications and education. Through the climate conversations, we met with people vulnerable to the transition to carbon neutrality. We held workshops with PPN groups. We held our online consultation, which is literally closing tomorrow. So if anybody hasn't engaged with it so far, please jump online and give us your views. And we held a series of interviews with experts from around the system. Again, we had some academics, local authorities, and research agencies that can provide us insights into how we're achieving what we need to do, and also from their own sort of experience and to support that evidence base. In addition to that, our social and behavioural research program includes not only benchmark studies such as climate change in the Irish mines through the EPA, but we also established a National Social and Behavioural Research Advisory Board, and members of the SEI, EPA obviously sit on that, and that helps give us a guidance on what does the research landscape look like, what's it telling us, and how is it informing on an ongoing basis the work of not only the national dialogue, but how we interpret the research findings to better inform policy in terms of the climate action plan, but also at a sectoral level. So I suppose in summary, in 2022, we established an evidence base, promoted innovation in public consultation by engaging over 400 stakeholders, 3,000 members of the public. We recorded these output and outcome measures from each activity, and they provided direct insight for policymakers in close to real time. So as I said, we'll be publishing these benchmark studies toward the end of the year, but as we've progressed, we've evaluated and provided reports on each of our activities to inform our sectoral areas, such as land use or transport or offshore wind, and also our own work on citizen engagement. What I wanted to finish up with is that as part of this overall process for the dialogue itself, this isn't, a fait accompli. We haven't designed the ultimate engagement or public participation process and program that's directly informing policy. We're always learning. What the evidence or the insights we're garnering so far from 2021 and 2022 have shown us that what we want to do simultaneously to be able to deliver this social contract is to influence policy, but also promote behavioral change. We found that through the EPA work that we know that awareness is extremely high amongst the population, and that's very effective it begins to inform us about policy. However, what we need to do is move to a space where we're actively and continuously engaging people across all of society and getting feedback and insights from those engagements. That helps us directly inform policy through that work. Equally, awareness does support how people think about climate change and climate action. And we can move people through things like choice architecture, especially the energy space, to demand side shift and how we use energy. And I know this is very critically important at the moment as we move into this winter. But equally, without moving to a space where we're promoting climate literacy, we're not actually effectively empowering people. So we can help people make better decisions. But what we want to do is help people understand the decisions they're making, to be able to choose those decisions for themselves in a way that's meaningful and useful for their decision making. This doesn't mean that what we're trying to do is ensure everybody in society suddenly becomes a climate scientist. That's not the space we need to move into. At a recent National Climate Stakeholder Forum, one interesting definition of climate literacy that came from the floor was that people just know enough to take action. So that's the space we want to move into. What do you understand by climate action? Are you actively engaged in it? Are you starting to progress where you're making changes in your life? But then moving into that climate literate space, it's a space where people understand what they need to do for themselves, how to access those kind of changes in a way that's meaningful, that's accessible, and that's fair to them. And that allows them to reflect on these changes and engage with us in terms of influencer policy. So I suppose that's a sort of very brief snapshot of what we're trying to do in the national dialogue space. And we're progressing and building this into our thinking in the Climate Action Plan 2023. And again, I'm happy to take any sort of questions or queries from the floor at this point.
Great, thanks, Rob. Actually, there is a question in here that the NDCA looks great. Definitely should have citizen participation to make our journey democratic, but often the demands of our everyday lives doesn't allow us to participate in the same way as we'd like. So how can you be sure of the effectiveness of the process, and if a significant percentage of the population don't participate, and what are you doing to encourage participation?
So for a start, I suppose our engagement program is multifaceted. So at one level, we're engaging with key stakeholders across society. They include people from, as I said, a variety of key sectoral areas. And we hold 3 national climate stakeholder fora a year. We engage over 120 to 150 different stakeholders that represent key organizations or populations across society. They directly inform what we should be trying to do in the Climate Action Plan. So they're presenting that voice of the organizations they represent, the communities they represent, and they're telling us these are the challenges we face, these are the things that we won't be able to do, regardless of even sort of funding or supports. These are key challenges. So we need to understand, for a start, what are those challenges? What are people able to do for themselves? And what are the barriers at a system level and an individual level? But what I mean by that is, it's one thing informing people, and then people want to make changes, but then they still face significant challenges in making those changes. We need to understand what they are, and do we need to support them by policy or strategic initiatives, or do we need to promote more awareness and engagement and support them through community initiatives? So another key facet of what we're doing is we're supporting through the Climate Action Fund. We're supporting a series of community projects across society through local authorities and other organizations to help people start delivering change at that community level as well. And just to finish up on that, it is really, really important that our view that this isn't simply about individual behavioral change, but this is about promoting collective action. So how do we support communities in delivering that, and mutual supports within communities to help people deliver on those changes as well?
Thanks, Rob. And just to, is this a quick question you could ask before we finish up? The success often of dialogue and engagement like this is actually feeding back about how you were listened to. And I imagine with the the inputs throughout all of that big map that you presented on, sometimes the solution that comes out, even though it's informed by inputs from various bodies, it's maybe not identifiable to them as this has been directly as a result of your input. So is there a mapping process and feedback process as part of this activity?
Absolutely. So the each activity, we will be producing a short report for each activity. Okay, so if you imagine that our PPN engagement are workshops with various different stakeholders, etc. So each activity has a short section in our reports that will be fed back directly to those people who took part in those individual engagement activities. Equally, the National Forum, we're doing the same thing. But the first report that I sort of mentioned in the presentation is the Climate Conversations report. That's going to be fairly extensive. It will show not only by type of engagement, what are the key insights, what are the key findings. It'll also then break that down by sectoral area to show these are the things that we heard from your sector and these are the suggested demands for action. And equally, what we'll be doing with both of those reports is we'll be, like we did last year, we invited a number of participants, but also had an online session to present back what we've heard. And we invited some of the participants in the National Dialogue last year to come and ask questions of the Minister directly and say, well, this is what we heard, this is what you fed back to us, but actually we need this to move forward. And the Minister was very giving of his time to have a conversation with people even after that fact. So we're building in that feedback mechanism to what we're doing. And this, the last thing I'll say is, I suppose it answers the last question and this. Critically, the whole program is designed founded on an outcome-based model. And by that, essentially, we mean we don't just want to deliver outputs, i.e. we listen to you, we fed it into policy, that's that done. It's how is this actually helping us change at a system level? How is it actually helping us support people at an individual and a community level to measure those changes? And this is where the Climate Change of the Irish Mind study and other key behavioral insights like the ESRI work and the work that you do, obviously the SCAI, how are those studies cumulatively telling us and showing us how people are making changes? And then we can measure that over time. That helps us really understand the effectiveness of the work we're doing.
Thanks, Rob. I better move on to our next speaker. Thank you so much for that input and insights. So next up is my SEAI colleague, Dr. Darragh McCoy, who leads our Behavioural Economics unit, and he's going to speak to us on encouraging sustainable decision making. So over to you, Darragh.
Thanks, Margie. Good morning, everybody. Delighted to get the opportunity to talk to you all today about the work that the Behavioural Economics unit is doing at SEAI. So I'm going to give a brief overview of the unit and then talk about some specific projects that we're working on, and then a couple of reflections on some key policy challenges and areas of research. Okay. Sorry, a quick slide adjustment. Okay, so firstly, what is behavioral economics and why do we need it? So behavioral economics, it draws insights from psychology, economics, neuroscience, and other disciplines to study how decisions are made. And ultimately, we know that people often make decisions that, an economist might call suboptimal, both for them and society. But what I mean by that is that people make decisions that aren't welfare increasing, in terms of, increasing their comfort with the home energy retrofit, reducing their carbon, reducing the costs of their heating by adopting, a different type of heating system, but often are not welfare increasing for society in terms of, overall emission reductions. And ultimately, what our unit tries to do is it tries to help people make better decisions. So it tries to help people make better decisions around energy and environment that are ultimately welfare enhancing for them and for society. Now, obviously, behavior is one element, and in terms, the low carbon transition is going to require deep economic and structural changes. But often they're accompanied by an element of behavior. So, taking a recent IEA example that, nearly 2/3 of energy emission or energy reduction required to reach net zero is going to require some element of behavioral change, either through modal shift or behavior changes relating to current technology, or through the adoption of new technologies. So these are kind of all integrated components in the low carbon transition. So how do we use behavioral economics at SEAI, or what do we do? Well, we try to understand how people think about energy. We devise mental models to try to reflect the way people think in terms of the barriers, the opportunities, and how people engage with the energy system. We pre-test policy tools and solutions. So we devise online experiments where we might pre-test different types of initiatives to see how people might respond if such an initiative were implemented. But ultimately, where the real value, I think, is in field testing solutions and scaling and measuring impact. So understanding what happens in real life when policies are implemented. And then all of these things feed into designing policy through a behaviorally informed lens. So trying to take all of these learnings and ultimately, make better policies as a result. So some key behaviors that we're interested in at SEAI are obviously adoption of electric vehicles, home retrofits, and low carbon heating systems. We're also interested in understanding consumption patterns, and that's something that we're at the behavioral unit, we're working more to get into analysis of real-time consumption patterns. But I suppose typically what we have focused on within the unit are things that we can measure objectively and quantify, which we can do through our grant program. So we've tended to focus on uptake as opposed to consumption. So adoption of electric vehicles, home retrofits in terms of the number and depth, and also uptake of different types of renewable heating system. So today I'm going to talk a little bit more about some past research and upcoming projects we have around heat pumps. Okay, so the first few examples I'm going to give are talking about encouraging heat pump uptake, and then I'm going to talk about heat pump performance and how we're trying to improve heat pump performance. So some past learnings from the unit, and I must say that a lot of this work has been started and undertaken by my our predecessors at the unit over a number of years. But some early trial results. We ran a large-scale randomized controlled trial where people were sent letters targeted using the BER database. We sent out 32,000 different letters to people, advising them about the benefits of heat pumps and framing the benefits in different ways. So there was a control group who received a relatively neutral message, and then multiple treatment arms who received information based on the health benefits, the comfort benefits, the cost benefits, and also an exclusivity treatment, which basically said that you have been selected for this, this exclusive grant. And what we found is that the message framing can impact the response rate, but not not really uptake at all. So after sending 32,000 letters, there's a statistically significant difference in terms of the message framing, but only 3 grant applications as a result of this campaign. And I guess the learning from this is that, there's a lot of other barriers and factors influencing people's decisions, and we need to take a more targeted approach. So current work is, now that we've identified oil-heated homes with a HLI of less than 2.0, and basically these are homes that have a very high level of insulation. In order to get an SEAI grant, you need to have a HLI of less than 2, which is a measure of the fabric and thermal ventilation of a home. And we can, but by targeting those homes and by specifically targeting oil-heated homes, we're essentially looking at people that have a lot of these barriers already removed. So they're already living in quite highly insulated homes. And also there's a significant emission reduction potential by targeting people on oil. So we've identified 61,000 homes on the BER database, and we're currently running with a couple of pieces of work. So the first piece was we undertook structured interviews with SEAI registered heat pump installers to understand the specific barriers and drivers for this group. And we now have just sent out a mail out to 20,000 people, running a survey experiment to assess some of these barriers and also to quantify their willingness to pay for these homeowners. So given the current cost of heat pumps, given the current level of grant available from SEAI, what are these people's willingness to pay? So what is the gap in affordability for these people? And the ultimate aim of all of this is to then design field trials where we can test everything that we've learned, these economic and behavioral interventions in the real world using grant application data. So the other piece of work around improving heat pump performance. So some past work, a Behavioral Insights series paper on heat pump adoption. I guess there were various learnings from it, but one of them was that complicated controls can impact user operation. So people were finding it difficult to understand and properly use heat pumps once installed. So we ran a randomized controlled trial with Indicon economic consultants to assess how can simplified information, simplified instructions improve heat pump operation. And we ran a trial on over 2,000 people where we developed mocked up online simulators of heat pump controls and essentially randomized people into two groups based on two common heat pump controller types. And then within each group, there was a control group who received the standard manual, and then a treatment group who received the manual plus a quick start guide. And what we found is that performance in a range of different tasks, ranging from putting in setting the temperature to setting more complicated tasks such as setting a schedule or a heat curve, we can increase performance by about 11% overall and improve comprehension by about 16%. So where are we now with this type of work? And ultimately, we want to start implementing these things in the field. So this, I think it's a useful insight, but really we need more data on how people use these technologies in real life. And a couple of related projects which the behavioral team have a part in, but are ultimately much more kind of involving various other parts of SEAI. We're running heat pump field trials to assess the impact of changing this heat loss indicator that I mentioned. So maybe we can install heat pumps in a wider range of Irish homes. So we're in process to run a field trial on 400 Irish homes to assess heat pump performance in homes ranging up to 3.0 watts per meter squared Kelvin, and ultimately trying to understand, what's the energy consumption or what are the energy savings of installing heat pumps in a wider range of homes, and also try to understand the user experience and how, customer satisfaction and comfort and various other factors. We're undertaking some historical analysis of SEI data, so we can identify about 61,000 people that have already installed heat pumps and have within a wide range of HLIs. So ultimately, we want to look at their energy consumption to see how this varies across these different groups. And all of this, the aim of all of this is to try to, better calibrate and inform future policies to try to support the low carbon transition. In terms of other research, really where a lot of this is going and where we want to go as a unit is trying to set up large-scale field trials using monitored, metered consumption data. And you can think of these in terms of a living laboratory where people are enrolled into a large-scale trial and undertake interventions, but also with an observatory element where we just want to see how people are using energy consumption in more detail in real life. And there's a bit of a lack of real-time data in terms of how people are using energy consumption. It's really important that we start to direct, more of our efforts as a unit towards energy poor and vulnerable groups. SEAI obviously does a lot in this space, but this I think is something that the unit we want to move into. And also we've been involved and had some discussions around demand flexibility and time shifting of demand, and going to be particularly important this winter given the supply constraints. So in terms of other projects we have ongoing, we're working with the Behavioral Insights team in the UK, using behavioral insights to encourage retrofit. We're providing ongoing analysis and support to DEC around the energy crisis. And we're working with SEAI and Marcoms, running a large-scale evaluation of community-based social marketing trials. And these are quite intense area-based interventions trying to encourage deep retrofit. So we've already started doing some profiling of areas, and we'll be looking to roll this out over the next few months. So quickly to finish up, we were asked to just make a couple of reflections on important areas of focus and key policy enablers. And I'm going to keep this quite quick, but I think a key one that, I'm hearing a lot about in recent weeks is, we need to get the pathway right and try to avoid technology lock-in. So in terms of the balance of district heating and heat pumps, we've got extremely high potential for district heating in this country. We also have other types of low carbon systems that we want people to adopt, and I think we need to start thinking about targeted policies. So zoning for district heating, differential policy supports depending potentially on where you live, if you're outside of these zoning areas. And I think we need to try and improve targeting based on people's location, based on potentially the people themselves, and also their dwellings. We need to better evaluate the impact of policies, so we know there's a consistent gap between the expected and actual impact of interventions. And I think part of the answer here is more open data. So we have significant public and private data holdings, but it can be hard even for people working on the inside to get access to some of this data. And I think we need better linking of resources like the BER database with smart metering data, smart heating controls data, to really try to evaluate the impact of a lot of our policies in a more comprehensive way. And I think a key one coming into this winter is that we need to manage the current crisis without compromising our decarbonisation goals. So we really need to protect vulnerable consumers. We need to avoid distorting incentives for other people, but we also really need to maintain the public acceptability of decarbonisation policies and not lose sight of the bigger goals that we're looking to achieve. And in terms of relevant policies here, I think we need to think about reorientating policies and the supply chain towards lower income groups and towards vulnerable groups. I think in terms of supports, we need to think about limited eligibility for electricity account credits and really targeting those people that need it. And ultimately to leverage, in terms of long-term societal change, leveraging these grassroots movement and citizen groups in terms of bringing everybody on board, which my colleagues on the panel are going to talk more about now. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Dara, and quite a number of questions coming in for you that we'll get to at the end of the session. Really interesting thoughts about different ways of measuring things. Anyway, there is a question that has come up about will the presentations, it's come up a few times, will the presentations be available to download? And yes, the presentations will be available after the event and they'll be shared with everyone that's registered, and the event will be recorded. So next I'm going to hand to Dr. Breed Walsh, who joins us from Friends of the Earth. Breed's going to speak to us about embedding citizens and communities at the heart of the energy transition. So I'll hand over to you, Breed.
Thank you, Margie. Good morning, everyone, and it's great to be here to speak about this today. So my name is Breed. I'm the Climate Policy Coordinator with Friends of the Earth, and I'm going to speak about our recent work on embedding citizens and communities at the heart of the energy transition. I'll do this now at two scales. So first, we'll focus on community engagement in offshore wind energy development. I'll deal with that quite quickly. And then the second, we'll zoom in on the household level, and we'll focus there on citizen engagement and empowerment. And I'll present some of the key findings from a recent research project that we undertook on the barriers to retrofitting and heat pump installation in Ireland. So this follows nicely on from Dara's presentation. Forward. All right. So in terms of development of renewables, we need to transition to an efficient renewables-based energy system as quickly as possible. This is news to nobody here. We're #1 in the world for the share of electricity demand that we meet by onshore wind. We're actually #2 in the world for the share of electricity we meet by wind in general. That's a huge achievement. Now, one of the key questions connected to climate change mitigation and the energy transition is how do we translate the scientific consensus on climate change into societal consensus, support, and action. Now, this is really important because the energy transition will transform how we go about our lives, how we produce power, how we heat our homes, how we move around. Now, some of those changes, they'll be carried out at scale by your large industrial stakeholders, but it's also about actions that will be taken by society, by individuals, by communities, and how they change their energy consumption and how they evolve over time to actually be energy providers through rooftop solar PV, for example. Now, Ireland has committed to deliver, I think it's about 7 gigawatt of offshore wind by 2030. So that's an ambitious target. It's good that we have an ambitious target. We also have a strong pipeline of projects, but we currently have 1 operational project. So there's a lot of work to do. And in that respect, the government then and the wind industry will need to bring communities along with them to ensure that it is a just and a fair transition, to make sure that it represents a means to link renewables. Particularly, you could imagine those large offshore wind farms off the west coast, the east coast of Ireland, that you can link those to rural community development along the coast, right? And then both procedural and distributive justice will be very important in achieving that. So procedural justice, then, it's all about having, you know, citizens and communities express their views in a meaningful way, in a way that it is impactful. And in the case of offshore wind, here I'm talking about the coastal communities of Ireland. In short, I see two important opportunities for community involvement. The first one is at strategic level. The second is at project level. So by strategic level, I mean a government-led consultation, and consultation in the true sense of the word, where it's iterative, you have feedback flowing back to those communities, it's not a once-off. But this government-led consultation campaign within those regions that will host wind, within those communities that will host wind, so that those communities know, okay, this is the plan, this is what's coming, we've had our say in this, we can help shape and mold the future of our communities and the future of our marine environment. This would build trust and transparency. Separate to this, then, you need meaningful, ongoing and iterative engagement at the project level, right? So also to incorporate local knowledge and make better decisions in that regard. Consistency in approach is key here, so that communities know what to expect, because communities all talk to one another. So it's important that we have an approach that is consistent. Now, there's often a perception of an imbalance between the really positive global benefits of, if we take wind energy, and then the perhaps negative effects that are experienced or maybe experienced locally, or that our locals may perceive that they will experience locally. So it's important then that the costs and benefits are distributed fairly. So in the Irish case, offshore wind, it offers a great opportunity again to link those offshore wind farms back to the coastal communities and to have these financial benefits flowing back to shore. And they could be used for local sustainable development projects. This could be community solar PV projects, biodiversity protection, maybe local food production. Okay. Now we're going to shift gears and we'll zoom in on the household level and the national retrofitting scheme. Now, the report you can see here on the right-hand side, it addresses barriers to the implementation of energy efficiency measures in households in Ireland. The findings I'm going to present, they're based on interviews with stakeholders across diverse groups, so civil society, academia, and the energy efficiency sectors. And the project was led by Friends of the Earth's energy policy specialist. So now Ireland's housing stock, unfortunately, is one of the most inefficient in Europe. It leaves many with high energy bills and vulnerable to shocks like we are all experiencing currently in the energy crisis. Now, our research here, it shows that there are still major barriers to achieving the Climate Action Plan target of bringing 500,000 homes to a B2 standard and to install 600,000 heat pumps by 2030. It does also highlight solutions, I'll say that now, but I'll come to that in a little bit. The report highlighted a range of barriers, right, that limit access to retrofitting for particular groups. Right, so the grants were not sufficiently accessible. They were reported as being not sufficiently accessible for tenants, for low-income households, for the travelling community, for rural dwellers, and those living in older homes. Now, the first point here, of course, is high upfront costs. Look, it's not surprising that high upfront costs act as a barrier. But what is notable is that a number of experts pointed to a lack of trust in the process of retrofitting itself, and low awareness of both the eligibility for grants and the benefits of retrofitting. There was also a lack of awareness of the costs of running a heat pump and how this compares to oil, gas, and solid fuels. Finally, then there's an issue here as well of readiness or feeling ready to retrofit. This idea of, I'm not sure, you know, many see it as a hassle or a big job or a source of stress and sort of put it on the long finger. So that's something to consider. Now, the retrofitting process is also complicated by a low standard of rental housing. The number of households living in the private rental sector in Ireland is increasing. We have about 1 in 5 households in Ireland are now renting privately. Over half of these rental homes have a BER of D or lower. So this means that tenants, they can spend large sums of money on energy, and they're particularly vulnerable as well then to price hikes. So our research indicated a lack of tailored finance, or that we need more tailored finance options for landlords for retrofitting. There was also a lack of clarity on tenant protection from what were known as renovictions. That was also highlighted as an issue. Now, minimum BERs for private rental properties will be brought in 2025, which is a very positive thing. But experts sort of warned and pointed out that if supports are not in place before this, just to support those landlords to retrofit, we may see landlords selling and leaving the market, which would result then in less availability of rental accommodation and would contribute to worsening the housing crisis. And then finally, there's a shortage of skilled labour and materials available to undertake retrofitting works. We need about 17,000 workers to meet the target of 500,000 homes retrofitted by 2030 as well. Okay. Now, although the barriers are significant, the experts that we did talk to, they put forward a range of solutions, some of which are already in train. Now, the SEAI Warmer Home Scheme for 100% grants, they argue that that should be expanded to include tenants who receive the housing assistance payment, especially given the energy price crisis. They also argued for a need for tailored supports and protections for retrofitting in the private rental sector. They also emphasised the importance of ramping up the retrofitting of social and local authority housing and the introduction of local community energy advisors across all counties and local authorities. And this would offer peer support and advice for those who are unsure of the retrofitting process, and also for those communities who may be interested in progressing retrofits slightly. And lastly, then they highlighted the importance of the government delivering the updated energy poverty strategy, as it leaves questions around whether those homes that are most at risk of energy poverty are being sufficiently identified and targeted in the retrofit schemes. Okay. Now, this is really important, that energy poverty strategy, because we have 29% of Irish households are estimated to be living in energy poverty. This is the highest rate ever recorded. Average household energy bills have increased by 1,100 in 1 year. The rising cost of energy prices, it will disproportionately impact households in the bottom 20% of the income distribution, and who spend a larger amount of their income or percentage of their income on energy. And now this situation has the potential to deteriorate further over the coming winter. The SRI have estimated it that if energy prices increase by another 25%, it would drive 43% of all Irish households into energy poverty. And one point on this before I'll wrap up, I have one slide left. We could be nearing a key tipping point here. It's possible that people's understanding of the energy transition will be changed due to the energy price crisis. We have energy poverty rising, the cost of living is rising, and there's a danger here that the renewable and energy efficiency transition will be associated with higher costs, and perhaps acceptance of the entire endeavour could be at risk because of that. So it's just something to keep in mind. Now, Friends of the Earth also released very quickly a 5-point plan to cut bills, save energy and reduce pollution, as well as just this week, we released a joint statement with 42 other organisations calling for the government to put forward measures to tackle energy efficiency, the cost of living and energy poverty. Very quickly on this, I'm just going to zoom in on the energy efficiency recommendations that are additional to those that I already mentioned. So the key recommendation of the 42 organisations is to prioritise the worst performing buildings and low income or energy poor households for retrofitting. They're arguing that we should be retrofitting all social housing to B2 by 2030, and that we should be increasing individual energy grants from 80 to 100% for those at risk or already suffering from fuel poverty. There was also a strong call from the organisations for government agencies to collaborate and directly consult with anti-poverty NGOs to deliver retrofits to people who need them the most. It will also require a phase down, phase out of oil and gas boilers in new homes this year, and also no fossil fuel-based boilers installed in renovated buildings by 2025. They called for that. And also that support should extend to providing solar PV on year-round occupied mobile homes would be really important as well. So look, addressing these barriers, they're crucial if we're to meet our targets and if we're to get Irish households off both expensive and polluting fossil fuels for heating and towards sustainable alternatives that will bring warmer homes and lower bills for everyone over time. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Breed. And a few questions coming in. Just to let people know, we may eat into 5 minutes of your break, but we're doing okay time-wise. And if we don't get to all your questions, we'll also try to add some answers to the chat function afterwards. So without delay, I'll go to our next speaker, Sinead Dooley. Sinead is Head of Public Engagement with EirGrid. So we heard from Mark earlier, and Sinead is right down delivering in terms of their engagement activities. So she's going to talk to us about the EirGrid engagement journey. So over to you, Sinead.
Good morning, and I'm going to, I'm hoping here. There's always one.
No, there you go.
There we go, and it's in the wrong mode. Good morning. While I'm sharing here at the moment, just in terms of delighted to be here with everybody this morning. I might just leave it as it is rather than in. Good morning. Look, I'm going to go with this sharing of the screens this morning, and I'm delighted to be here in terms of joining the dots. And we're going to be a lot of repetition because thankfully we're all on the same page in terms of our need to bring all of society with us in our approach to our energy transition. So a great phrase of mine is joining the dots. And today I hope to show where we can join policy to practice, but also in terms of bringing society together as a whole on our journey to the energy transition. A lot of us will have been speaking to the journey set out briefly here. Now, much better. Thank you for that. Look, we've spoken of policy here. Everything we do in terms of our engagement journey has been underpinned by external European and national policy, and our own strategies have evolved, obviously, over the years within EirGrid to match those ambitious targets and to match our national policies and strategies. But it has to be said that we've been on a huge learning journey within EirGrid, and it's no secret that delivering large strategic infrastructure is not a simple process. And EirGrid, and you heard from Mark Foley this morning, would admit to the fact that from our Grid 25 development back in 2008 that met with vehement opposition, and more than other legacy projects we have come on that journey in bringing society with us to where we have seen positive interaction on our Celtic Interconnector, our North Connaught and others to date. So today I want to take you on that journey as to how we've gotten to a far more positive place, I hope, with communities, with society, in terms of recognizing the need for that infrastructure to help people understand their targets. And it really is only with public support, and we've heard that time and time again this morning, that we will achieve a secure, sustainable society and supply of energy for next generations. So what have we done to try and counteract that? So in terms of our new strategy for public engagement, it was hugely important that our roadmap for engagement, our framework for grid development, emphasizes our group principles of engaging for positive change and delivering partnerships for better outcomes. On the bottom left, you will see our donors, our approach, our considerations when delivering this infrastructure. So Mark Foley heard this morning saying we will always find a technical solution, and thankfully we will. We look at the environmental aspect of it, but at the core and the deliverability is social acceptance. Unless we bring the public with us on the journey, create an understanding of the need for the infrastructure, accept their input and work with them in terms of bringing the project to fruition, it's not going to happen. So we're really working hard on social acceptance and looking at enablers around improving our participation and engagement methods, enhancing our community benefit, and I'll speak more to that later, delivering educational and ambitious campaigns with our partners, and our approach to landowner engagement. Not from the top-down approach, but working with our landowners in terms of a bottom-up approach to finding solutions, to opening gates, to delivering projects. In terms of the engagement capacity, there was a recognition within EirGrid that we needed to build our own in-house expertise in terms of engagement and capacity. And our team is growing and building, and some of our CLOs are on the call this morning. And what I'm doing at the moment, and what EirGrid are doing, is looking at a different skill set in terms of our people on the ground as well. We're complementing the existing staff we have by bringing people with community engagement experience, community development experience, in terms of people who know how to work with communities, that bottom-up approach and bringing people with you, and not a top-down of telling people what they want to hear, asking for the answers and working with communities. And our partnerships are critical to this, and Friends of the Earth, Development Perspectives, Irish Eurolink, SAI, ESBN, many others are part of the journey with us in terms of working together. So the engagement journey, I've spoke to the engagement strategies. We've established community forums, a new initiative within EirGrid and indeed within industry in general. A community forum is established in the area in where the project is being delivered, and that's now at preconception stage. So we work with local community representatives, local political representatives to co-design our activities, to look at our routing principles, and indeed to co-design our routes for these projects. Looking at the local knowledge and insight, which is critical to us, and I'll speak a little bit to that in a second. Co-delivery of the community benefit, and many of you on the call are community activists, and you know the bureaucracy and the red tape that we've experienced over the years. And in my former life, that was the one thing that always caught me, that you were expected to put 3,000 words into a little box that captured the impact of the program that you were delivering was going to have in communities. So what we're doing is our community benefit, as opposed to opening a funding application, we're going in with communities in advance of the funding becoming available at the very start of the project. We're establishing the forums and we're bringing in independent facilitators that will look towards the sustainable development goals. How can we maximize the benefits that are already in the community? And there's a lot of funding available through municipal authorities, through your governments, through your climate action support. But how do we collectively work together as a community, joining those dots to ensure that we can maximize the funding that's available, with a focus on sustainable development goals at the heart of it and an impact that is measurable afterwards to those communities. Highlighting the community forums because they've worked extremely well with us in bringing the communities with us. So we ensure that the communities are at the heart of the decision-making process. And that's not just a tick boxing, that's a really genuine effort in our behalf, and it really is working to date. They provide us with the relevant input and local knowledge that help our engineers that Mark spoke about earlier, in terms of not changing their minds, but working with them, that if there's a constraint that a local person will be aware of, that they feed that into our mapping process. And it's been very valuable on our Kildare Meath most recent project. It's been very evident there. So we're working with groups and organisations to build trust, identify local needs, grow our partnership, as I said. We provide governance and transparency around the implementation of community benefit. What do they receive in return in terms of being part of this? They receive regular updates from our engagement team on the ground we're delivering, that they're not going to be hearing about in the local papers, that they're part of the process and know every step of the way what's happening, why it's happening, and how it's happening. And then they in turn advise us on how to communicate that to the local community and the hard to reach in the community, that everybody is dealt with on an equitable basis. So the lessons learned, how we apply them. We've seen our community forums work extremely well in rural locations. So EirGrid at the moment are tasked with a huge body of work in the Dublin area, in the urban centre. Loads of utility providers and others have been doing this for years, but it's a first for EirGrid. So it made perfect sense to us to join the dots in Dublin. So we looked at bringing all of the chief executives of state-owned industries, of state-owned bodies, of industry together to see how we could collaborate. There's nothing worse, and you know it yourself as a citizen, in one utility company maybe opening the road today, and 2 months later, another utility company arrives. We're trying to join the dots to be sure that communities are impacted as little as possible in terms of delivering infrastructure. We're looking at existing assets. How can government bodies, how can agencies, how can local authorities work together to share assets? If there's a greenway being developed in Dublin City, can we work with the local authority? And we are working with local authorities to see, can we input our infrastructure into that as part of it, rather than having two obstructions, and maximising our assets, our intel, our staff, our joined up thinking in terms of everybody working together for the greater development of Dublin City. So that's a body of work at the moment. And with that, we set up the Dublin Infrastructure Forum. It's the first of its kind. I said you were all the top level, public transportation, utilities, local authorities, enterprise boards are working together. And in parallel to that, we're establishing Community, Business and Industry Forum. Again, bringing people together, your public participation networks, your community council, community forums, landowner businesses who've already been impacted enough through the last number of years through the pandemic, bring them together to work with a solution, find a solution towards less impact on communities and delivering our infrastructure. That's how progress on our engagement looks to date. I'll leave the slide because we're circulating, but of all of that, I suppose the deliberative dialogue has been key, in our opinion, to the success to date of our engagement strategy. Deliberative dialogue was tried and tested on our Shaping Our Electricity Future that Mark spoke to earlier. That's it in a whole in terms of the engagement we did, but for the purposes of this morning, in the interest of time, I want to call out the deliberative dialogue process, where we brought 99 citizens at random to the table, the same as the Citizens' Assembly. Over just 2.5 days of providing information, creating deliberative dialogue, debate, input from experts, it was amazing to see a sea change and a shift in the thought process from some quite opposed at the very start to the need for infrastructure in terms of additional infrastructure towards meeting our targets. But when we explained, obviously, the need for us to provide the infrastructure, if we were to look at retrofitting our homes, electrification of our transport system, the demand on increased housing to facilitate renewable energies towards a clean, green energy system. When all of that was debated and explained over the 2.5-day process, it was amazing to see the sea change. What we did do was listen. We listened, and out of our Shaping Our Electricity Future, we came up with a roadmap. I'm leaving it there for you to see because I don't have time to speak to them all today. But the one thing I do want to really bring out this morning is just in terms of joining those dots, the policy to practice. Going on the last speaker to say, how do people know that you've listened? Where can they see that their input has been acknowledged and is being put into practice? I'm going to choose the regional Citizen Energy Assembly. You wouldn't want to say that in a hurry. From listening to people, they want to be involved. They want to know how we can retrofit our homes. How do we get involved in microgeneration? I have land, I have sheds, can I sell back to the grid? There was a lot of questions, but there was a lot of answers too, because SAI are doing fabulous work, ESBN are doing fabulous work. I think we're doing fabulous work too. The regional companies, your partnerships, everybody is on the same page. We're all working hard, but we were working, I feel, in silos. So what we did is we reached out to Ruth Buggy and to Ellen Diskin and all of our colleagues, and we said, why not do a roadshow, taking it around the country? So EirGrid are happy to facilitate those roadshows. We're bringing all of these stakeholders to the table. We're traveling around the country, and this was a May evening, a fine evening in Donegal. And Margie, it's almost my last one, I know her to the clock, but this shows the interest in the communities. This is an area where we don't have infrastructure projects. So you had a packed hall where people wanted to listen to SAI and wanted to find out more, wanted to listen to ESBN about microgeneration. The appetite is there. Society is moving with us, but we need to provide the tools to bring them with us. My last slide is just shown when we're asked to do the policy, practice and recommendations. I'll say to you, Margie, I'll be very surprised if anybody today comes up with new policies, because community and voluntary organisations already know what's needed. We all know what's needed, but what I would say is that this forum and platform, bringing everybody together, will hopefully drive the message home. So I'm saying that we need roles dedicated to engagement in academia to support and facilitate the engaged research process. Huge work has been done. The department have to be commended, and others. The work is happening, but we need more of it, and we need to join it together and bring everybody with us. Evaluating the impact of that engaged research is hugely important. It is emerging, but it requires more funding, that we take the grey areas into account as well in terms of measuring an impact. And finally, because this is something that's coming up time and time again with voluntary and community organisations, particularly around the coastal communities now, we need to provide seed funding for collaboration on pilot projects involving multi-stakeholders. Communities need to be allowed the time and the support to fail and to succeed in that. Let's take away some of the bureaucracy. Let's take away some of the red tape. It's difficult to measure impact when you're filling an application form for funding. So let's provide the seed funding to allow community, voluntary and NGOs work with us and prove the expertise that they have in delivering towards a climate action plan. And thank you for that.
Thanks, Sinead. Fantastic overview and a really nice segue into our last speaker. As I said, in between last time, we will run until 20 past. So I have the great pleasure of introducing another of my colleagues, Ruth Buggy, who leads on our sustainable energy communities, but has a wealth of experience in supporting those communities. And really, what we've heard in Sinead's, the communities are out there doing it, and I know there are some present listening today. So handing over to you, Ruth, for your presentation.
Many thanks, Margie, and it's a great pleasure to present here this morning. And I think, much like what Sinead said, a lot of what I'd say will be echoing what's happened already. So I think there's some reassurance in that, but there's also a shared challenge that we have to overcome. So in terms of the presentation this morning, the title is around energy communities leading the societal transformation to a low carbon future. So I just wanted to give a little bit of background and context around what we currently do and the types of supports that we give to communities currently in SEAI. So firstly, we have the Sustainable Energy Communities Programme. So this was set up in 2015, and it's primarily a network of communities on a peer-to-peer basis where they can share their understanding and experience and the opportunities that they have. And we're currently at just under 700 member communities, so it's growing quite significantly. We do have a target to 2030 under the Climate Action Plan to double that figure, so a significant challenge ahead. Communities get supports when they join the network from mentors that can help with training and funding, and they get 100% support to develop local energy master plans. So that's really trying to look at who the main types of energy users are locally, and then see what opportunities exist for that local community. Communities share very often common challenges, but the opportunities can be quite different from place to place. And it also allows the communities to prioritise those projects that are most important and valuable to them. The Energy Master Plan can then also be used as a guide to help communities identify which SEI programmes or other programmes best suit their delivery of that ambition. Our programme is underpinned by the policy objective of the 2015 White Paper to engage and enable the energy citizen. So moving on from that, we then have a programme which is about a capital grant programme to help deliver that ambition. So Better Energy Communities, or the Community Energy Grant, as it has alternatively been known, is a large capital grant programme that offers between 30 and 50% funding for communities to reduce energy locally in their homes, businesses and community buildings. It is primarily focused on an energy efficiency programme. And I suppose what we're seeing as communities join the network, more and more of them have an interest in the renewable electricity and the renewable energy sector. So we need to find ways of supporting that in a stronger way. There are a panel of project coordinators that can help deliver those large scale projects, and we're delivering about €100 million of grant aided works every year. And that programme has actually been in operation since 2012. So it has evolved a lot since 2012 and has certainly grown in scale. The first year it was 1.8 million, and as of this year it's about 40 million in grant support. So it's grown and it has changed, and it will continue to evolve and hopefully evolve to suit the communities as well. In terms of renewable energy communities, we do provide supports in this space, and we've worked with the department and supported communities who have participated in the community category in the large scale community generation projects. And we also have a panel of trusted advisors and early stage grant support. So Sinead mentioned communities having the space to fail and succeed. And we know from international research that a lot of community large scale renewable projects don't succeed in commercialization, but a lot is learned along that way. And we've worked to design a program that de-risks those early stages where the risk is greatest and where the communities don't have the capacity to fail at those stages. So hopefully we've accommodated those concerns in that. That program's been in place since 2021. We also work alongside the department and we support the community benefit funds. So communities near new large scale wind and solar projects, both onshore and offshore, will have access to a fund amounting to between €1 and €2 billion over the coming decades that could really support their climate action ambitions. And this is from a levy on the generators at €2 per megawatt hour. So there's an awful lot happening in this space, with myself and my colleagues supporting a lot in this area. So when we move on and talk about opportunities, this presentation here is trying to say that there's an awful lot more opportunities, and each community has kind of to build their own jigsaw of their, I suppose, opportunities that exist for them, but that the future vision is really energy communities at the centre, or to use Sinead's term, in the centre of the donut, to have a long-term strategy with everybody involved, with the dots joined up, with clear funding options, to be very socially inclusive on climate action activities, ensuring that just and fair transition, that we're building local skills and capacities, and that communities experience the value of projects with enduring value for them. So to get there, we really need communities to have that access to reliable funding and technical resources from which they can build local projects. And that's really, really important that we give them that. Sorry, I've just jumped ahead slightly. So this is the future vision. So the future vision is communities leading local action and contributing to a national ambition of a zero carbon future. And they will need those aspects that have been spoken about here a lot, but we need to ensure that we also have adaptable and flexible models to suit each community, and that then there is capacity building to support the delivery of the community ambition. And I think Mari mentioned earlier that we need to set that vision of what a low carbon future looks like. And for that, we need excellent demonstration projects to build confidence that these solutions are correct. And we certainly need new finance models to support longer term projects and to realise those bigger impacts. So then looking at the challenges, we could do the challenges all day, but I think what I really wanted to put in, and I hope this reflects very much of what's been said as part of the earlier part of the event, energy and climate action can be an enabler of other community ambitions. So better health for better air quality, reducing energy poverty, more economic activity in local businesses, lower congestion noise associated with switches in sustainable transport options, improved social interaction and better cohesion, and facilities that are available to communities at a much lower cost of operation and a much higher level of comfort. But that it will need an all of society approach to build this cohesive response. And we need to be very clear what the value proposition is for all sectors. So we quite often are willing to tell people what their sacrifice needs to be or what change they need to make, but we're not clear about who gets the gain from that change. I think we need to be really transparent when we're talking to people that this is what it's going to take, but this is what the outcome can be. And, you know, there's huge changes in energy security and energy cost concerns, and it can eclipse climate and sustainability. And I think that's what Breed mentioned earlier on, that we can end up associating these two things as the same, and they're not. And hopefully one is short term and hopefully one is long term. But we're going to need to build capacity at all levels, and it will take a lot of time and a lot of people to be involved. Then we were asked to kind of put together some research questions and area of focus. And I suppose the questions I have from the experience of running community programs, and I have lots of them, so it's great to have such an audience here today to engage with, but how do we build that capacity in local communities? What's the right model? And we do it and we try and everything else, but I'm sure there's better ways that we could be doing it. Then what is the appropriate role or roles for communities to undertake? At the moment, if they participate in a grant program, they're either acting as a beneficiary or a lead. Is it right that they should be there? Is that the right model for them? Should our grant program be based on a delegated responsibility to deliver, or should we have better partnership roles where we share the risk in the delivery of projects? I know which side I sit on. And then how do we achieve local consensus on climate priorities? So my priority is not your priority. So how collectively do we identify what those shared priorities are? And then really, how do we invert the administration burden away from communities? A lot of us here today, it's our job to administrate grant programs. It's not a community's job to administrate grant programs. So how do we take that administrative burden away and give them the freedom and the time to do what they do best, which is engaging people and finding solutions? So there's a lot in that. And then areas of focus is, what's the balance of structured models in this versus flexible solutions? So this is like an admission. I'm an engineer, so I love structured models, but communities need flexibility. So I constantly struggle between trying to put this really rigid framework on a program because communities are so diverse. So you're trying to keep that flexible to adjust and accommodate the different interests. And it's a constant struggle, but I'd love to see more research on what's the right balance between those. What financial instruments can we develop that support communities beyond grants? We're creating this reliance on grant programs as being the only solution. Before the current price rises, communities would often say to me, we don't have enough money to take this action. And my response would be, well, every 250 homes would spend about €1 million a year on energy. And we can show you with some small changes how to save €100,000. We can save 10% with you. So you have €100,000 every year that you didn't have before we had this conversation. What do you want to do with that? And with grants and interventions, we can save 30%. So it's not money, it's processes and systems to support that. So how do we develop those models to fund and fully support community projects? Is it right that communities have to go to 5 or 6 different departments and agencies and organisations to build the 100% model? Why can't we find one way that we can bring the money together at a government level and allocate it to communities? How do you build climate and energy literacy? And I know it's come up before. And then how do we really value the time and effort of communities? I think it's so critical that we ensure that we do this. And then just the pictures are there just as a reminder, at all times, this is about people. They have diverse skills, they have diverse interests, and they have diverse capacity. So they're the heart of it, and we have to remember that we keep them there. So then just my last slide, and I know I'm between everybody and a cup of tea, so I will be quick, I promise. But when we asked about policy needs and enablers, I started to write out all the different things I wanted. And then really, I felt it was more important that we made sure that our policies were easy to access and understand, flexible to community ability and ambition, and balance the needs and opportunity of across all members of the community, and that we build inclusivity in policy design, but most importantly, we ensure inclusivity of benefits. So they were kind of where I was trying to get to. So then I continued to decide what I wanted on policy as well, just because I had the opportunity. But really, capacity building models, participation pathways, community influence in decision making, a wider range of impact metrics, not just payback or cost per kilowatt hour. How do we coordinate policy objectives, and the balance between local agencies, authorities and local communities. So really connected programs prioritizing community needs in their design, long-term integrated plans, funding consolidation, and public consultation processes could be made more accessible, breaking them down into sections that are relevant to communities rather than giving them 200 pages to read with loads of questions, that their attention is drawn to the section that will be of their interest, and we make the most of the time they have. So really and truly, that's the hope, and thank you very much. And I really look forward to the opportunity with the follow-up discussion. So thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Ruth. Look, we've had a really great journey over this session through various different perspectives. I'm very conscious that we have reached into the break, and there's a whole page of questions I had, and plus other questions from those listening in and participating. First of all, thank you so much for the questions. What I'm proposing we'll do is actually a number of them we will answer through the chat forum, and they, in particular, those geared towards our SEAI colleagues, will be able to get that information pretty quickly. To Breed and Sinead, we might talk to you afterwards and see if we can get one or two answers to some of the questions. I'm just conscious of it's a packed format for the day and giving people some break. So I would really, though, like to thank you all for your input and presentations today. It's shown us, I suppose, a different perspective to how we measure and what we measure. Given us ideas around the processes to engagement and where barriers might lie and how do we learn from them, and then ways in which we can activate communities and where are the gaps of knowledge. So thanks, Ruth, because we're about to head into the research sprint after the coffee break, which is trying to address some of those gaps of knowledge, but they will continue and we really need to figure out how we support them. So thank you again for everybody for participating. Questions, apologies, didn't get to dealing with them immediately with the panel, but we will try and get them out to you in the chat forum. We're now going to take a short break, and we hope you'll join us again at 11:30 for the next session, which will take us through a research sprint. So thank you.